Welcome everyone to this installment of the Department of Fish and Wildlife Conservation Lecture Series. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Whitney Albright. I work in the Science Institute here at the department, and along with my colleague Nicole Russell, who's also on the line, help to facilitate the Conservation Lecture Series. So as usual, before we introduce our guest speaker for today, just want to go over some quick logistics for the lecture today. First, you've probably noticed that you are all muted, and that is to help us preserve the audio quality because we are recording the talk today. After the lecture, the recording will be processed, and then we'll post it to our lecture series website within a couple of weeks of the lecture. So if you know of someone who missed it and who might be interested, or if you'd like to view the lecture again, please do check our lecture archive page for the recording. I do also want to make a quick note. The lecture from January has been posted to the archive as well. If you'd like to check out that recording, that one is available for a limited time only. I think we'll be taking that one down in the next few weeks. So I do encourage you to take a look at that one sooner rather than later if you're interested in viewing that recording. Okay, also for today, once I turn it over to our speaker here in just a minute, we'll hear a presentation for around 45 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for a dedicated Q&A at the end. I do encourage you to type questions into the chat box throughout the presentation as they come up, and we'll keep track of those and make sure that they're all relayed to the speaker at the end during the discussion. So do feel free to type those in throughout while they're fresh. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker for today, Dr. Hugh Safford. Dr. Safford is a regional ecologist for the Forest Service Pacific Southwest region, which includes California, Hawaii, and the Pacific Territories. And he's also a member of the research faculty at UC Davis in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy. And he manages a staff of Forest Service ecologists that provide expertise in vegetation, fire, and restoration ecology, also climate change, and inventory and monitoring through the national forests in the Pacific Southwest region. And the Safford Lab at UC Davis is focused on applied ecological support to resource and fire management in California, neighboring states, and other Mediterranean climate regions. So we are very excited to have Dr. Safford here today. Please give him a virtual welcome. And with that, I will turn it over to you. And let me stop sharing my screen here.
Great, thanks, Whitney. So with your permission, I'm also going to turn my video off while I give my talk. I can't think of many things that are as distracting as watching oneself speak on a video call. So let me get this up and running first, just a second. All right, and you can tell me, Whitney, whether or not this is functioning properly. Okay, let's see. That come up?
Yep, looks good.
Fantastic. Okay, so I should note, first of all, that this is basically a build out of a similar talk I gave to the Wildlife Society Western section about a month ago. So I don't know whether any of you were attended that event, in which case about 70 or 80% of the slides are going to be repeats of things you've already seen. So I'm just going to start right into talking about fire trends in the state, what's leading to those, and then I'm going to be talking about vegetation implications of those fire trends as well. And actually, before I forget, just got some notes here just in case I don't want to forget things. So the source of fire obviously is ignition. And so here are a couple of different graphics, which are really, really important reference graphics for anyone who's working with fire, vegetation, or any kind of habitat that's affected by either of those two things. So on the right is from the Van Wagtendock and Cahen paper in Fire Ecology in 2008. I think it'd be time to update this, but I mean, in terms of just the general patterns, they're probably very similar. Gives you an idea of the importance of lightning as an ignition source in California. And what you can see is that basically it's a major part of the ignition landscape once you get to about the Sierra Nevada crest, out into the eastern deserts, and then in some of the higher elevations of the eastern Klamath Mountains. And what the point I guess I want to make about this graphic is that as a result, all of the fire records that we see, for example, in the fire scar data that are analyzed and published out of, for example, redwood, oak woodlands, and things like that along the coast, almost all of those historic ignitions back before Euro-American arrival were anthropogenic. There's very little lightning caused wildfire along the coast. It does happen, and some years it happens in a big way, like last year. But in terms of the total number of ignitions out there, it's really very uncommon. And in fact, the coasts of California and Oregon are the region of the United States that has the lowest lightning strike density at all, outside of, I think, Alaska has a lower lightning strike density across the state in general. So then the graphic on the left is a more recent graphic. This is from a paper that Jennifer Balch and some other folks did in 2017. And then CAL FIRE updated the thing. But what they've done is they've gridded the state out. And then the circles that you see, number one, their size is proportional to the number of fires they represent in that 20-year period. But then the colors refer to the percent of the ignitions in that period that were human. And you can see that today, the same pattern obtains. That is, the lightning ignitions are obvious. Those places that get primarily lightning ignitions are the blue places. The red ones are almost entirely human ignitions. And you can see, even though through fire exclusion, we've stopped most Native American ignitions on the landscape, the places that have the highest human abundances today, which were the same that had the highest abundances then, are the places where most of the ignitions are human. Anyway, this is important because understanding, being able to answer questions related to things like restoration, fire management, habitat maintenance, things like that, they rely a lot on understanding what the source of fire was historically and what it is today. Okay, sorry, yeah, just basically in the rest of the presentation, I'm going to be talking generally often about quote unquote Northern California. And I'll just note that Northern California in this presentation is Northern California and the Sierra Nevada. And then what I will probably call often just Southern California actually is the Central Coast and the South Coast. Okay, so here's the fire regime baseline for California. Scott Stevens calls it the pyro state. Probably it's one of the landscapes on the planet that has the highest fire hazard and now the highest fire risk as well because of all the people in harm's way. Australia would be another one of the big couple on the planet. So this is a map that I just crosswalked over from the land fire maps for Western US. And it's generally close enough that I think we can use it to talk about some general patterns. And so that you'll see that quote unquote Northern California polygon that I referred to earlier is dominated by the yellow type, which is what we would call fire regime group 1. And what this map represents is the natural fire regimes, quote unquote, that existed before Euro-American settlement, i.e. these include indigenous ignitions. And you can see that most of that landscape supported very frequent fire. FRI stands for fire return interval, or the number of years on average between fires. And these mostly burned at what we call low severity, exactly because of all the fire that did a good job of removing fuels on the site. And then you'll see this Central and Southern California polygon. It's a little bit of variability near the Bay Area in this map, but really most of it's in that orange color. And these are from what we call fire regime 4, which is fires of sort of intermediate frequency between 35 and 200 years between fires, but that when they burn at high severity, basically because you've got plenty of time to accumulate fuels, but also because a lot of this landscape is chaparral and coastal sage scrub, which actually accumulate their fuels again already within 8 to 10 years after the last fire. And in fact, you can burn them 1 or 2 years after fire if you have one. So let's look at some of the trends in the state. This is the annual burned area since 1908. I started the graph in 1908 because that's the year that the Forest Service began obligating its field units to keep data on location and size of fires. The state data sets become a little bit more, the state data sets start to be collected around the Second World War. And actually, I mean, in terms of the real high accuracy, this thing is quite accurate after about 1948, 49, 1950. Just want to note that you can see that for most of this graphic until about whatever, the 1980s, that it was pretty steady, right? And this is really essentially the result of federal and state policies of fire exclusion that were begun in the late 19th century in most of the state. But they were most effectively implemented after about 1935. And I've got an arrow at that point because this is when the Forest Service promulgated what we call the 10 a.m. rule, which is required district rangers to extinguish any ignition on their lands by 10 a.m. the next morning. But other things happened here as well, right? I mean, you had addition of newer technologies to firefighting about this time, like aerial water bombers, increased availability of mechanized equipment. And then also after the end of the Second World War, of course, you had the return of millions of young men to the U.S. Looking for work. And that also played a very important role. So what I did here is I've telescoped the burned area from that last graphic down to the period 1980 to 2020, which is where all the action was in the previous slide. And a couple of things to note here. So the red circles represent years in which over 1 million acres burned in California. And the 6 years that you see there are the only years in the full data set since 1908 when that 1 million acre mark is reached. And all of them have occurred since 1999. And then also note that 3 of the last 4 years have exceeded this mark. And in 2020, we exceeded 4 million acres. So the point that I want to make with this graphic is there's sort of an inexorable rise in burned area. I should also note that in this graphic, in the last and a couple of the next ones too, there are dotted lines, and those are the 5-year running means. But when you show this graphic to people, and when I say people, I mean, I'm including everybody, right? Policymakers, the public in general, the media, resource managers, and even to be candid, a lot of fire managers. The common response to this is something along the lines of, oh my gosh, look at all this fire, and how in God's name are we going to keep California from burning up? But what I would like to make clear to you is that it's very important that we understand these trends in the context of California's fire history. And the best estimates that we have for sort of the average burning year before 1850 is that somewhere around 18,000 square kilometers burned in an average year, right? And by the way, 1850 is a period that I'll refer, before 1850, I usually refer to that as pre-Euro-American settlement or pre-EAS, because that's really when we had the first massive incursion of Euro-Americans into California, after the finding of gold in 1849. But basically if you look at the data set since 1908 till now, that's 113 inclusive years, I guess. And there's exactly 1 year in that entire data set that comes even remotely close to the levels of burning that characterized California for millennia before 1850, and that happens to be 2020, the year that's typically branded as sort of a catastrophe or a fire Armageddon by people. And I just want to make clear to you that on average, burned area in California continues to be far below what we might call ecologically normal levels, and that this lack of fire is a major factor of ecological degradation in the state's ecosystems, and really ecologically speaking, sort of the state as a whole. Reducing burned area is really the wrong measure of success, except in some urban areas in Southern California, the Bay Area, and in some ecosystems such as sagebrush, chaparral, coastal sage scrub, for example, where the real issue is actually too much burning. But really, across most of California, by far most of California, the real issue is not burned area, but rather it's the way that fires are actually burning. So an interesting nuance that I just wanted to allude to, because it's going to kind of direct my presentation for the rest of the time that I'll be speaking, is that essentially all of that change that you saw in that last graphic in terms of burned area is happening in the northern half of the state. So what you can see here is that Southern California is the red triangles and the red trend, and the blue is in Northern California. And what you can see is that Southern California, which for decades has been the US poster child of fire catastrophes, has actually seen no statistical change in average burned area in 40 years. But on the other hand, what you see is beginning in the 2000s, there's this really strong and more or less exponential rise in burned area in what are really mostly forested landscapes in the Sierra Nevada, the North Coast, and in the Klamath Ranges, and then obviously also in sort of that Southern California-like matrix of oak woodlands and mixed evergreen and chaparral that you get in that knot of Lake County, Napa County, Sonoma County, Yolo County there as well. So another major difference between Northern and Southern California is the way that humans have affected fire frequencies in the landscape. So this is a map of the fire return interval departure, or what I'll just refer to as FRID. And it compares current fire frequencies computed over the last century, more or less, to the fire frequencies that characterized ecosystems before Euro-American settlement. So areas in blue represent landscapes where current fire frequencies are lower than before Euro-American settlement. And the dark blue areas are areas where fire has been almost completely absent in the last 110 plus years, given this, the recent increase in fire actually notwithstanding. And this pattern characterizes what I called before Northern California, right? And it's occurring in landscapes dominated by what I call the formerly frequent fire forests, or the F4 ecosystems. And these are ecosystems like oak woodland, yellow pine, dry mixed conifer, moist mixed conifer. So these ecosystems, as I noted before, used to support really frequent fire every 5 to 15 years or so on average, that burned at relatively low severities, again, precisely due to all the fire, which reduced fuels on the landscape on a consistent basis. But most of that Southern California polygon and Central California polygon that I showed you before, which is what's supporting all the warm colors in this graphic, is experiencing increased fire frequencies over pre-settlement averages. And these are due to high densities of people and thus high densities of anthropogenic conditions as well. And I should note that this pattern is also coming to characterize the Bay Area now. Predictably, I think all of it, we've been predicting that for quite a while. It's surprising actually how long it took. But you won't see that on this map because there aren't any Forest Service lands near the Bay Area, so it wasn't analyzed in this particular study. And then finally, I want to know that you'll note that there are some blue islands in Southern California, and probably most of you understand implicitly what those are. Those are the Sky Island forests in the San Gabriel, San Bernardinos, and the San Jacinto Mountains, San Gorgonio wilderness, for example. And basically, these are southern outliers of Sierra Nevada vegetation, right? Where fire exclusion in these F4 ecosystems has also resulted in a reduction in fire frequencies. Oh, sorry, I kind of wanted to, I should have hit these as I was going. I apologize. I always forget what gizmos I've got in here. Anyway. All right, well, since all of that action is basically in Northern California, I am going to focus most of the rest of my presentation on this region, although I'm totally open to talk with you if you have questions about what's going on in most of Southern California. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use the Sierra Nevada framework area as a surrogate for the entire area. And you can see on the left there, that's the polygon that I'll be talking about primarily. Basically, I'm using it as a surrogate for the rest of Northern California because the patterns are similar. And really, to be honest, is because I already had these data analyzed. And so it made the presentation a lot easier. But here, we're not actually looking anymore at overall burned area. But what we're looking at here is the proportion of burned area that burned at what we call high severity. And in this, I've pulled out things like chaparral. This is forests and woodlands only. And it actually only goes to 2017 as well. Actually, this one may only go to 2016. And the reason for that is that the comprehensive data set that we use in the Forest Service was compiled by Jay Miller from our fire and aviation staff, and he retired a few years ago. And so we're busy trying to catch up with him and run all of the small area fires that don't get run by the national MTBS program. But anyway, the pattern is going to be the same. And what you can see is here, again, an inexorable rise in the percent of the area that's burning at high severity. It was back about 20% in the 1980s, and the average is now, well, it's about 37 or so on this graphic, but actually if you add in 17, 18, 19, 2020, it'll be at 40% for sure. And then probably more important, actually, well, before I get to the next graphic, I'll just show what this is. So one of the things that we do is to think a little bit about, the context for a graphic like that, like I showed you earlier with the idea that burned area actually is not the way that it's out of whack in California is there's way too little burning on average rather than too much. And what this shows is essentially the natural range of variation for probable percent high severity in Sierra Nevada framework forests and woodlands before Euro-American settlement. And this is from the natural range of variation document that I published along with Jen Stevens in 2017, which you can get online. It's about, I don't know, 250-page book, basically, that summarizes everything that we know about these forests before Euro-Americans began to show up in mass after 1850. And that belt's about 5 to 15%. And what you can see is that throughout most of this time period, we're already well above that. And of course, at this point, we're getting up to where we're 3 or 4 times above it. And then I think the next graphic is probably more meaningful to you, especially those of you who work with habitat. So this is the high severity area. Basically, we're looking here at not at overall burned area, but rather the area burned at high severity. And I guess I should define that high severity. What I mean by that is, in this case, it's more than 90% tree mortality. So it's what we would call essentially a stand replacing fire. And in the insect area, you can see an example of 100% mortality. And again, to clarify, actually, this is basal area loss. So essentially, it's a surrogate for the amount of biomass loss, live biomass lost on the site. Anyway, as you can see at the beginning of the time series in the early 1980s, the average of the area of stand replacing fire averaged about 10,000 or so hectares. And based on the evidence we have, this is notably above the average between the 1940s and the 70s. But what you see is the regression line really starts to rise in the early 2000s. And actually, it's currently about 7 times greater than it was at the beginning of the 1980s. Oh, and then I should note again that there's some red circles in this graphic as well. And again, these are due to the fact that we haven't been able to compile all of the small fires yet for 2018 and 19. And the 2020 data actually aren't going to be available until 2021, because the data that we tend to trust are the 1 year post-fire, because they do a better job of catching actual medium-term tree mortality. And then, so here's another similar graphic to the one I just showed before. There's the gray bar again. That represents the probable natural range of variation for high severity burn area in the Sierra Nevada framework area before Euro-American settlement. Again, this is referred to in Safford and Stevens' tome, but this is the focus of Chris Malik paper that he led in Ecosphere. And we've actually updated this now for the last 8 or 9 years. I think Malik only used data up to about 2009, something like that. Again, though, you can see here that our best guesses are that between 15 and 25,000 hectares probably burned at 90% severity or higher, or a mortality or higher. And essentially what's happening here is that, until the late 1990s, early 2000s, most years fell below this bar. But beginning in the 2000s, you see a real strong rise. And in the last 9 years, 8 of them have burned areas at high severity that are well above the natural range of variation. And the regression line is now about 3 times higher than the pre-Euro-American settlement mean. And then in this case, the 3 red circles are we had to make estimates based on severity proportions across the earlier part of the graphic, and then just simply multiplying those by area. So they're actually probably underestimates. Okay, so question, why is fire severity climbing so strongly in Northern California? Well, as you've heard in all the media reports and stuff that's come out recently, there's certainly a pretty important climate warming signal in the pattern. But I think for the forest types we're talking about in Northern California, that the trend is really maybe even mostly driven by the long-term lack of fire. So this figure is from a study led by Zach Steele at UC Davis that shows the proportion of fire area burning at high severity as a function of the time since the last fire. And this is in yellow pine and mixed conifer forests. And the strong relationship is because in the absence of fire, these ecosystems accumulate fuel, right? Basically, the heavier the fuel loading, the bigger the bonfire. And it's telling to note that the strongest climate warming signals in California by far are occurring in Southern California, but fire area and fire severity are not increasing in Southern California. So what are the effects of these fire trends on old forests? So here are outputs from a simple model of forest succession and fire dynamics that I built a while back and then published it in a paper in 2018. And so what this is a pretty simple model. It's an aspatial state and transition model. It links vegetation serial stages with transitions that are driven by growth and the effects of fire. And I attributed the model with a fire frequency distribution that approximated the pre-Euro-American settlement period, which in this case is a mean area weighted fire return interval of 13 years. But then what I did was I ran two different simulations, both of them starting, by the way, with a landscape completely occupied by old forests to be conservative. One of the simulations modeled fire severity based on pre-Euro-American settlement rates, which is about 6% high severity when we weighted by area based on the best available information. And then the other simulation modeled fire severity based on the current severities, which at the time that I built this model averaged about 32%, but they're much closer to 40% today. And as you can see, the simulations are really different in terms of their outcomes. If fires before Euro-American settlement had burned at the severities we see today, old growth forest would have been really rare on the landscape. The simulation, if you look at the blue simulation, that took only 50 years to reduce 100% old forest landscape to only 20% old forest, and then only 100 years to reduce it to 5%. Whereas the scenario that's incorporating the pre-Euro-American settlement, fire severities ended up in the gray area at about 40% old forest. And that gray area represents the best estimates in the literature as to the natural range of variation spatially and temporally for the percent of yellow pine and mixed conifer forests in the Sierra Nevada that were what we would call old forest at the time, it's sort of the beginning of the 1850s. And these are from a bunch of different sources, including some original research and observations made at the end of the 19th century, but also based on portions of old forest found, for example, in Yosemite and Sequoia Kings Canyon. Anyway, so I guess I'll finish up by just noting that the reason I actually built this model was to counter suggestions that we run into now and again in the literature and also in litigation that suggest that modern fires are nothing to worry about, that they've always burned the way they're burning now, and that old growth dependent wildlife species, for example, are well adapted to huge stand replacing fires like this. And I would just simply counter that a model like this makes it pretty clear that old forest is actually in pretty deep doo-doo in California. So, okay, oh yeah, and then I also brought this in. This is a new slide because I remembered after I built the old presentation that there was a study done by Scott Stevens and colleagues where they looked at current burning trends and their likely impact on California spotted owl nesting habitat. And I'm assuming that a lot of you have seen this paper, but basically using data up to 2014, they simply built a projection, not simply, it was a complicated process, but they built a projection of burning trends in the CWHR classes that support spotted owl nesting habitat. And basically what they found was that by somewhere between 2067 and 2142, an area equal to the current amount of caspo nesting habitat is going to burn up in the Sierra Nevada. And then what I'll note is that this model only uses burn data up to 2014. So no, if you live in California, you'll realize that starting at about 2015, hell's pretty much broken loose. And so this may actually be a really conservative estimate of how much longer we can expect to hold on to that habitat in the state. So what about younger trees? So here are trends in the Sierra Nevada framework area in mean and in maximum high severity patch size. And in the left graphic, you can see that mean patch size has increased about, I think about 50% over the last 35 years, while maximum patch size on the right has actually increased by about 8 times. In the beginning of the 1980s, it was rare to see high severity patches that were greater than 1,000 to 1,500 hectares. And indeed, in those days, we thought those were absolutely enormous. But today, it's not uncommon anymore in fires for us to see patches bigger than 5,000. And most of the last few years, we've seen patches bigger than 10,000 hectares. And I mean, that's big. That's approximately the size of the city of San Francisco. So what do these high severity patch size trends mean? So this is a figure from what I think is a fascinating study done by Stevens and colleagues when he was at Berkeley in 2017. And then I'll note that I'm also including reference there to another paper by Zach Steele, which looks into essentially the same pattern, but it's kind of from a different angle. And what this study did was it took the core areas of high severity patches, and Jensen, his co-authors, defined core area as the area that fell more than 120 meters from the surrounding forest edge. Basically, and then accumulated the area in those patches, right, as they were created by fire between 1984 and 2015. And over the course of that period, that area sums to about 100,000 hectares or about 250,000 acres. And think about how big, though, this area would be if this study had included the last 5 years of fire when things have really gone nuts. And I should note that the importance of the core area, as they defined it in this study, is that it represents the part of the burn landscape that's beyond the normal dispersal capabilities of conifer tree seeds. That is, it represents an area that'll likely remain tree-free for a long time. But it also represents the part of the burn landscape that's been withdrawn from the bank, basically, with respect to potential nesting or even foraging habitat for a lot of important wildlife species, such as the fisher, the spotted owl, and as it turns out, even the blackback woodpecker. I'm assuming you were probably more on top of the wildlife science than I am, but I've read some fascinating studies in the last few years that have shown that the life histories of all three of these species are really strongly connected to the fire and vegetation patterns that characterized this Sierra Nevada framework area for the millennia before Euro-American arrival. So this is another new graph. I just wanted to note, based on sort of that core area principle, that there are areas inside of these patches where it's, statistically speaking, pretty difficult to get a forest anytime soon because of the fact that most of our conifer species don't disperse seeds very far, and that very few of them, in terms of their populations, are actually serotinous. That is, that they're adapted to reproduce after really hot fires. I should note as an aside that that's a series of studies I'd love to do, is to look at what's going to go on with knobcone pine in California over the next 15, 20, 30, 40 years, because it is really well positioned to take advantage of this, since it really needs a super hot fire in order to be able to regenerate. But I think another really important set of filters are related to the conditions that seeds actually encounter if they do land in one of these high severity patches. And this is from a study that Kevin Welch led that we published in 2016 that summarized results from, I forget how many fires were in the study, close to 24, I think. No, maybe it was 13 or 14 in this particular one. I think that these days we have about 24 fires worth of data. Yeah, sorry, it says there on the left, 14. And I just want to note that in these high severity areas, you can see that they are characterized by relatively low litter. And, these are 5 to 9 years post-fire. So there's been plenty of time to accumulate this stuff. Very little in the way of live overstory, so there's no shade in these places, a lot of bare ground. There's quite a bit of grass competition, and probably most importantly is there's a lot of competition for light and for nutrients from shrub cover, which tends to be very, very high in these sites. So they tend to be hot and dry, and there tends to be major competition. So even if you can get a seed into the site, the likelihood that it germinates and then turns into a tree is low and getting lower all the time. So what does the future hold? It holds a lot of fire. I mean, we have spent a lot of time combing the literature, looking at all the projections that are out there. Christina Restano, who's now over at UNR in Extension, and I did a summary of California climate projections in one of the chapters in the latest edition of Fire in California's Ecosystems. And every single fire projection we found in the literature predicts more fire, it predicts bigger fires, they predict more severe fires. Well, that is, more severe fires until we've burned so much that there actually isn't much woody vegetation left to burn, which is when severity starts to drop. So I'll just summarize the fire severity trends now. I'll note that, number one, overall burned areas are actually notably below pre-Euro-American settlement levels for most of Northern California, but they're rising quickly. And I will note that burned area is not below pre-Euro-American settlement levels in areas surrounding our major urban areas, or in some of the shrubland types I referred to earlier, such as chaparral, coastal sage scrub, and sagebrush, for example. Secondly, Euro-Americans have drastically changed fire regimes. In most of the forested ecosystems, there's been a long-term lack of burning due to fire exclusion, whereas in some of the ecosystems in which the canopy fuels are closer to the ground, and hence they tend to burn hotter and it's easier to ignite and get a fire to carry. In those places, actually, they've experienced increased fire frequencies. Some of that's, of course, due to cheatgrass invasion in the Great Basin as well. And then number three, these changes are leading to a rapid increase in fire severity in forested ecosystems, such that although overall burning is still in deficit, the areas burning at high severity are at a huge surplus, and this is not the good kind of surplus. So what do these fire trends mean for ecosystems? Major changes to fire regimes, interactions between changing fire regimes and climate warming, they're all having major consequences for ecosystems and their biota. And these include drastic changes in a lot of things. I've listed some of them here. They include vegetation structure, increased drought stress, increased mortality, changes to growth, to reproduction, dispersal, to seedling survival, altered rates of nutrient cycling, and water provision, major carbon losses in the landscape, increased erosion, and so on. So in the last few slides, I'm going to cover how vegetation is changing and how it's projected to change as a function of fire and some of the other stressors and disturbances that interact with fire. So what these are actually somewhat older maps at this point. These were generated by Jim Lenahan, Ron Nielsen, Dominic Bachelet, and some other folks from Oregon State University and the Nature Conservancy using the MC1 dynamic global vegetation model. This has now been updated to MC2, and I've seen some interesting outputs from MC2 recently. But anyway, this model models climate, vegetation succession, carbon dynamics, emissions, fire, things like that. And again, I'm going to focus on the Sierra Nevada framework area, which is approximated by the black polygons in the maps. So I think an easier way to compare these outputs is to turn this all into a big old bar graph. So what I did here was we just added up all the pixels in the map outputs and then summed them so that we can look at what's likely to happen in this model in terms of projected vegetation change. So basically on the left side, there are current conditions. On the right side are the modeled climate scenarios. And since we don't really know where climate's going, so I mean, it's obviously going to be warmer, but our precipitation projections are actually still pretty variable. Although I will know, if you take a look at most of the more modern projections, most of them suggest similar to maybe even more precip in California over the course of the next half to full century, which I don't think will counteract the summer warming. I think we're still going to be looking at more physiological drought in the summer. But it's interesting because at this point, it's the only one of the world's 5 Mediterranean climate regions where precipitation is projected to probably go up. Anyway, that's the whole thing. Since we really don't know what's going to go on with future climates, typically what people do is they look at ensemble means or they look at consensus, right? And so let's look at the commonalities among the scenarios. Basically, all of them project a big loss of subalpine forests and woodlands, which hasn't actually really started yet, and I'll talk about that in a second. They all project some loss of conifer forests. 2 of the 3 models project a pretty big loss of conifer forest. And those are largely to be replaced by hardwood-dominated forests and woodlands. And what that is represented by is the cumulative area of the green and the brown bars, which are those quote-unquote mixes. They project an overall loss of shrubland, mostly due to highly frequent burning, especially at lower elevations. And the thing that probably alarms me the most in this is the huge increase in the area occupied by weedy grasslands that are, of course, the inevitable result of repeated high severity fire. And if you want to see large areas of weeds and exotic grasslands, go to Southern California, where there used to be vegetation that burned off due to a whole lot of high severity fire. So I want to note that the modeling that I just summarized for you, it doesn't take into account actual empirical changes happening on the landscape today. So we can actually compare Forest Service vegetation maps drawn in the 30s versus the 2000s to see that most of the projected changes are actually well underway already. And I'd just like to acknowledge Jim Thorne from UC Davis, who did the grunt work in getting these maps scaled to the same scales and getting the vegetation types normalized as well, et cetera. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this thing, but basically in general, what we see is a general loss of yellow pine dominated conifer forest, which is driven by logging of a lot of the ponderosa and Jeffrey pine, obviously and sugar pine, but also fire suppression, which is turning a lot of the system into a fir dominated and very dense system. But climate warming has a little bit to do with this as well. There's a clear increase in hardwood density and forest cover in the Sierra Nevada. That's climate and disturbance happening at the same time. It's a little bit of loss of subalpine forest. And then finally, there's a major loss in oak woodland, but that's probably not mostly a climate or fire related issue. That's just urban expansion or agriculture. Oh, let's back up there again. Already talked about that. I just want to talk about some of the other stressors that none of the modeling takes into account. And this is actually, I think, is the gold standard for future modeling as to how to take into account all these other interacting stressors that we've ignored up till very recently. And those obviously include bark beetles. I also want to note that one of the things that really scares me is the gold-spotted oak borer, which is moving quickly north from Southern California now. Probably the major projection of conifer loss at lower elevations in places like the Sierra Nevada is that they'll just simply be replaced by hardwoods. And so, well, we lost the ponderosa pine, but that's okay, we still got forest. Well, if you go down to Laguna Mountain or Orange County, the Santa Anas, or it's getting up into the San Bernardinos and the San Jacintos now, there's this new beetle that's come out of northern Mexico and southern Arizona that is just wiping black oak out. It's just unbelievable, the amount of mortality. And I think it's only a matter of time before that thing shows up. There are other things like white pine blister rust, right, which isn't accounted for in any of these models. This is having huge impacts on sugar pine and western white pine, and now it's starting to kill white bark pine populations in holding hands with beetles. For example, North Shore of Lake Tahoe has just been an amazing amount of white bark loss up there in just the last couple of years from interactions between beetles and blister rust. Obviously, invasive annual grasses are a big issue in some of the vegetation. I live half the year in Lake Tahoe, and cheatgrass until 15 years ago was a real rarity up there, and now it's just absolutely everywhere. And when you interact these things, right, fire, insects, disease, drought, and then add pollution and other stressors, and these are provoking some really serious vegetation changes across California, right? So a lot of forestlands that have transitioned permanently or quasi-permanently to shrubland and grassland. This is an example in Southern California on the left and in Eastern California on the right. A lot of forestland has transitioned to shrubland. If everything works right, and if these systems don't burn again really soon after the original burn, there's a decent chance of getting forest back on some of these landscapes, but with changing climates, warming climates, droughtier summers, all that kind of stuff, and the increased probability of reburn, I think a lot of this landscape isn't going to transition out of this state. And then in SoCal, obviously, a lot of shrubland has turned to weeds. We're standing in a site here that in the foreground, I can't see a native species. Oh, maybe there might be an Amsinkia there in the back right. But this is essentially what Southern Cal foothills look like now, right? These used to have coastal sage scrub and chaparral on them, and now they're just weeds. But I also want to note, really, really importantly, is that fire exclusion, really until very recently, has been probably the most important, quote unquote, disturbance that we've wreaked on. Probably more of a perturbation, I guess, is the word that people would use, that we've wreaked on these landscapes, right? Huge areas of what used to be open pine forest that was very resilient to fire and drought and other things has converted to very dense fir-dominated forest. And it's very unstable in the face of both climate and drought, and climate warming, and drought and fire. And then a lot of our meadow systems too are starting to fill up. This is Tuolumne Meadows back about 15 years ago when a new forest park superintendent decided they were going to go, fully feral and just let the system go where it was going to go. And then I think some congressional drove through the park and said, hey, this is called the Meadows. What's going on with all the trees? So I don't know. I've heard recently they've started to let them grow out there again, but that system's going to fill up with trees immediately So the last thing I want to do is I just want to talk about a qualitative study I did with some coworkers back in the early 2000s, because this never got into press, but I like to refer to it. Some of you might remember that SoCal experienced a major drought back at the beginning of the 2000s that I see really as pretty much a dry run for what we saw between 2012 and 16. And a lot of trees ultimately died from this event. I was on a team of scientists that was asked to project the likely effects of the drought on the ecosystems of the San Bernardino Mountains. And one of the things that we did was we ranked all the major tree species according to their susceptibilities to important stressors that were interacting with the drought, right? And this graphic is from that work. And I just want to draw your attention to the circled species, which are those least susceptible to the respective stressors. And what I want you to notice is how often incense cedar shows up as a winner. And we thought this was amazing. None of us had even thought about this before. I mean, incense cedar isn't a dominant species anywhere in California. It's really kind of an accessory, right? And mixed conifer forest. And you just don't see landscapes dominated by incense cedar anywhere. So these results suggested that it might be a more dominant presence in the future once all of these stressors had their way. Well, I can tell you that the forest managers didn't want to hear any of this stuff, and they thought we'd gone off the deep end. And in the end, I think our report, I don't think they ended up getting used really in any way. But the thing is that when you drive around this landscape today, for example, if you drive between Lake Arrowhead over to Big Bear Lake, the thing that strikes you is the outrageous density of incense cedar trees on the landscape. Basically, once all of its dead competitors were cut and removed from the forest, it emerged as the clear winner. And you can see similar conditions to that today in the southern Sierra Nevada as we cart off, millions of dead ponderosa and sugar pine. And now with the scolitis outbreak, increasingly white red fir. And the thing that's sort of emerging from the forest is a bunch of incense cedar. So I think the point that I want to make is that the trends are not only going to affect forest structure and function, but they're actually changing forest composition as well. So in summary, fire is interacting with climate to provoke major changes in vegetation. A lot of them are already occurring. As fire regimes continue to change and as droughts deepen, conifer regeneration is becoming progressively more difficult. I mean, I think if we're lucky, a lot of the landscape will succeed to hardwood-dominated forests. But as I noted before, there are some novel insects and disease moving north from Southern California and inland from the coast in the case of sudden oak death, for example. That really worry me, and particularly if the state's going to get warmer and maybe wetter in the wet season, I think we're setting ourselves up for some real nasty surprises with respect to Phytophthora ramorum and maybe some other Phytophthorus, things like white pine blisterus as well, which do much better in wetter conditions. Major structural and compositional changes are going to happen in California conifer forests, and we're watching them happen right now, right before our eyes. A lot of areas dominated today by conifer forest are going to succeed to shrublands after recurring high severity fires. And in other places, shrublands will be lost to grassland as fire frequencies increase. And I think, as I noted before, I think something that's very worrying to me is I think that a lot of these lower elevation ecosystems that are currently dominated by woody vegetation are going to transition to grasslands, dominated by exotic species. And if we're lucky, we'll have some oaks in those grasslands, but this is going to have really huge impacts on biota and a whole series of ecosystem services. Thanks for listening. I'm happy to take questions.
All right, thanks so much. That's a good summary graphic here for the end of the presentation. I was starting to fall into the worried category. Well,
I was just, I noticed, I don't know if you guys saw this in the news, but apparently they just figured out, the story behind the madman in the Edvard Munch painting of the Scream, right? I thought, yeah, the story is it's actually Homer Simpson. Anyway.
More you know. Well, thanks, Hugh. There's definitely a lot to digest there about the future of California and forests in California. We do have several questions that have already come into the chat. So folks, definitely please keep those coming. And if it's okay with you, Hugh, I might start just going down the list here and kind of rapid firing these at you.
Sure, no problem.
Okay. Well, let's start from the top. The first question that we had came in closer to the beginning of the presentation when you were showing graphs of increases in burned area. Mm-hmm. Scott asks, has anyone plotted this fire data along with California population growth and suburban development expansion?
Oh yeah, sure. Well, I've particularly seen it in Southern California, but yeah, I mean, you know what it's going to look like. It's going up. And I'll note though that, you know, the human ignition. So this is actually a pretty interesting story. And if you just do a, you know, Web of Science or Google Scholar search for, well, what would it be? You know, human ignitions, comma, California. Kind of interesting is that the proportion of fires that are started by people versus by lightning in the national forest system is actually going down a lot. There's way more fire these days caused by humans, or by lightning than by humans in the national forests. And we attribute that, I think most people attribute that to two things. One is education. I mean, Smokey the Bear is probably just about one of the most effective public relations campaigns ever. But also the fact that we've got such, I mean, think about the amount of money and infrastructure and people that we have invested in trying to stop fire in the state. And in forested types, at least until recently, it's a lot easier to put a fire out than it is in chaparral or in grassland, right? Because there's a big disconnect between the canopy fuels and the surface fuels. And it usually gives us a little bit of time to get in there and get something out. I mean, we still get 98% of those things out before they get to be a couple hundred acres. But where you're close to urban areas, there's a strong connection between human densities. And those are mostly what we call state protection areas, right? The areas in which CAL FIRE is the lead firefighting agency. In places like that, human ignitions are going up. And I think where you'll see the really big changes in the Bay Area. I mean, we've kind of been expecting to see that one for a while. And then it just really started to take off in 2015. Lake County, I've always sort of jokingly referred to Lake County as San Fernando Valley North. Obviously didn't look anything like it, but just the way that it burns and the number of human ignitions in that system is just kind of unbelievable. I think actually a lot of it was like meth lab related for a lot of years. But that's a landscape that's burned extraordinarily often. And I'll note that for those of you who are in Sacramento or in the Davis area, the single place with the most burning in the entire state of California in the last 20 years is the area right around Lake Berryessa. Who would have thought? I would never have predicted that 5 or 10 years ago, but there are places near Lake Berryessa that have burned 5 times in the last 20 years.
Sorry, mute difficulties. Okay, we've got a few more here. John asks, can manual fuel load reduction projects realistically simulate the pre-1800 fire regime?
Well, so yeah, so that's a great question, but there are a couple ways that has to be answered. One is that there are a lot of different surrogates, we call them, for the effects of fire on fuel structure and fuel loadings. And the key is to get the fuel out of the system, number one. I know that a lot of places they use mastication, and mastication really is only going to do a good job if you can get the masticated load either to decompose before the next fire or somehow get it off the site before the next fire, because you're actually not removing the fuel load, you're just adding it to the surface fuels, right? It might make the fire somewhat more controllable, but it's still going to kill most of the stuff on the ground surface because there's so much fuel there. But hand treatments, mechanical treatments, and prescribed fire, and ideally all of those combined in a series of visits to the same site, do a great job of reducing fire severity. I mean, there's so much literature on it now that it's kind of a joke that people think that there are people out there who believe it doesn't work. I guess it's like people who believe that there was a different outcome to the last election. It's like, well, wait a minute. But anyway, the question is more the scale, right? So the problem is that it's an issue on, I don't know, tens of millions of acres in the Western US, maybe, I don't even know the exact number anymore. And in California, it's certainly millions and millions and millions of acres that we've affected through suppressing fires, through logging all the big trees and then suppressing fires for the last century. And the scale of our interventions right now are absolutely postage stamp sized compared to the gigantic package that's got to be mailed, And so that led to, so that there, for example, that recent MOU that I'm guessing that a lot of the listeners know about, where the Forest Service and the state of California agreed to scale up treatment to where we're treating about 1 million acres between us. But what you have to remember is that the actual average amount of area that probably burned in California before 1850 was about 4 million acres, which is about what we burned in 2020. And treating 1 million acres a year is only a quarter of the solution. You know what I mean? So, sorry, I could go on and on about this one because this is the classic wicked problem. Because it has economic and political sides, it's got environmental sides. There are really important ecosystem service issues related to this. We know that thinner forests do indeed raise stream levels and provide more ecosystem water and human water. But you know, it just comes down to whether we can figure out a way to invest in the landscapes, and maybe it's going to come down to water. Maybe we have to work out a system in California by which water users actually fund, you know, watershed restoration. Because right now, the scale of the commitments that have been made in the state, they're not going to do it, and the economics aren't there. I hate to be I'm a pessimist or realist about a lot of this stuff, but we don't have a command economy. You know, you can't have Chairman Mao or whatever just tell the country, you now will, you know, go out with your buckets and solve this problem, and half of you will die. But rather, it's if there's not an economic market, nothing will get done. So, developing new ways of marketing timber and non-timber forest products. Developing a new sawmill infrastructure in California. There are very few sawmills left in the state that can process wood. And remember, wood put into building structures is sequestered for a pretty good amount of time. And then figuring out how you get sawmills out there that aren't just going to simply serve private lands, but also are going to be open to serving public lands. You know, all that kind of stuff. And energy infrastructure. For dealing with, you know, adding biomass to the mix and all those kinds of things. All those are going to be needed to foment sufficient work. But then to finish my really long answer is that even with those things, you know, piecemealing 10 acres, 100 acres here, 1,000 acres there doesn't do it. And that's why most people who work in the science of fire and of fuels are convinced that it's going to take beginning to allow natural and maybe even human-set ignitions under, you know, very moderate fire weather conditions to burn on a lot of the landscape. And on the public lands, that's already been potentially possible since the early 1970s, right? When the Park Service and the Forest Service transitioned to fire management from fire suppression. And they do it, you know, Yosemite, Sequoia Kings Canyon, a lot of the Forest Service wilderness areas in that area let a lot of their lightning ignitions burn anymore. And they've done a great job of restoring large landscapes as a result, and also reducing fire risk and making it easier to put fires out when we have to. It's also increased water and habitat and all sorts of things, pretty well documented. But it's got to get moved down into the yellow pine and mixed conifer belt now, because that's what the problem is. And I will say that there is an optimistic thing to refer to, other than like some of the others I referred to, like the MOU, is that the new forest plans for the Inyo, the Sequoia, and the Sierra include the designation of I think it's well more than 50% of the landscape on those three forests for eventual fire use as the major management intervention. A lot of that just simply already starting now in wilderness areas, but then expanding to places where we've been able to do a little bit of strategic fuels work to, you know, protect the ecosystem, protect people living around it. But I think that when you realize that almost all the fire that we see these days is the kind of fire that's ignited on those what we call 95th or 97th percentile days where we can't stop them, that's what people think fire is. But you have to remember that by definition, 95th percentile day is a day in which only 5% of the days in the year are that severe. Most of the days of the summer, we love the burn effects that we get from fire under almost all conditions. And we have to find a way to be able to safely actually incorporate fire on the landscape under the bulk of the fire season days. Sorry.
We had, there was a question here about prescribed fire, but I think you kind of addressed that in your response. So I'm gonna skip over that one and then really quickly ask a small follow-up to what you just talked about when you referenced lightning strikes. David had asked, although lightning strike fires are rare along the North Coast, are lightning storms forecasted to increase? Do we have that type of information?
Oh, that's funny. Well, I have read some stuff on that, and it's pretty equivocal. I've seen papers suggesting both more lightning and less lightning. I think if you just think about first principles, Earth's getting warmer, it's going to move the air more, and if it's warmer, there's going to be more evaporation off the ocean. I would think, if I weren't running a big model, I might think, yeah, that's going to be more lightning. The other thing is, almost all the lightning in California comes from the monsoon, right? And we're right on the edge of monsoonal influence. We typically don't get much, and it washes up against the east slope of the Sierra and the east slope of the Southern California mountains, and kind of, blows it all down there. And so what effect will warming have on the monsoon? And again, if I were just thinking first principles, I'd think, okay, warmer continent means the monsoon is going to be drawn further into the continent, which could mean more lightning. But to be honest, the modeling that I've seen actually is projecting less lightning from monsoon. So you got me. There's something out there they don't understand. But I agree with that if lightning were to become more of a fire source on the coast, ooh, it'd be crazy. I mean, look at 2020. Can you imagine if that happened every year?
Oh, hope not. Okay, we have a couple of questions about forest composition and potential transitions in the future. So I'll kind of group those here together. Christy says, giant sequoias have really taken a hit owing to drought and fire. Do your models suggest that this community will type convert to mixed evergreen woodland or perhaps another community type?
Yeah, I don't know that was the Lenahan models, and they suggest that, that most of that landscape will, if you give it 50 to 100 years, will probably largely hardwood dominate if there's hardwoods around. So I would have said, if you had interviewed me before this summer, and I was interviewed, and I did say this, so I'll just say that's what I've said, is I would have told people, don't worry about giant sequoia. Don't worry about redwood. They are supernatural beings. They can put up with just about everything, particularly redwood, because it resprouts and it loves it when you beat the ecosystem up, because everyone else takes a hit and it just comes right back. But giant sequoia when you look at those big trees, I mean, their bark, it's feet thick, and their cones actually are serotinous, right? And the species and the regeneration is dependent on, severe enough fire that you're burning off all the organics above the mineral soil. However, in the last year, there have just been some amazingly depressing revelations about the impacts of climate change and fire interactions with climate change on sequoia. And a couple of years ago, folks working, Nate Stevenson, Adrian Doss, other people working for USGS and for the Park Service in the Southern Sierra started to notice that sequoias were being affected negatively by climate warming. That there are now some beetles that used to be just a nuisance to sequoia that appear to be able to actually kill them now because of the high water stress they're under. And then in just the last couple of years, Nate Stevenson sent me a note. I'm going to get this a little bit wrong, but in it, he said something along the lines that, in the previous 50 years, 10% of the giant sequoia stands had experienced a wildfire. Whereas in just the last 5 or so years, or maybe it was the last 10 years, 2/3 of the groves have burned. And having wildfire in giant sequoia actually is something I think normally we'd welcome and say, hey, that's fantastic. We shouldn't be so worried about it. However, the 2 fires we had in the Sierra Nevada this year were basically like a gigantic atomic bombs, because they burned through that landscape in which we'd had 160 plus million trees die over the previous 4 or 5 years. And those are all falling down on the ground and standing there as giant candles, really increasing the amount of heat that's generated by these fires. And there were a lot of monarch sequoias that were killed by fires this summer. And it'll be a while before people can really get the inventory done. But I think that I wouldn't say that anymore about giant sequoia. I would say we need to be very worried about it. And I changed my mind in less than 2 years on that.
One more question about, a community species. I'll just read this. James asks, how will increased fire severity in coastal forests of Northern California affect composition, specifically in mixed oak and coastal redwood forests? So will these mixed systems persist as they seem to be projected to do in the Sierra? So you might have touched on that already.
Oh, that's a great question. So a couple things. If you're looking at the coastal forests per se, those are in trouble. Because, the coastal forests, redwood's a component of a lot of that, but not all of it. But I'm talking Sitka spruce, red cedar, western hemlock, right? Those are those little stringers right along the coast that come all the way down out of Alaska And those species, they don't deal with fire. Those are gonna be gone if you start burning those systems a lot. And my guess is it'll start to happen at some point here. So once you get onto the alluvial terraces, you get into the away from the ocean, you get into the redwood, right? And I still would say that I'm not really that worried about redwood. However, so the caveat is that with sudden oak death, and again, there's great science on this, and I'm assuming that a lot of the viewership here has read this stuff. Dave Rizzo's lab and Davis has done some of this, and then some's come out of Humboldt State as well. That shows that areas of heavy sudden oak death mortality or infestation, where it's killed a lot of tan oaks, has resulted in very high, large diameter fuel loads, probably not as much as what we're seeing in the Sierra Nevada, but, hundreds to thousands of tons a hectare. And these have led to some redwood mortality. They saw that in some of the fires in Big Sur in the last 10 years. And some more recent burning, I've heard some rumors of this kind of thing as well, in the North Coast, where fuel loads are going to be high enough because of all of the oak mortality from sudden oak death that you could have some severe enough fire to actually blow holes even in the redwood. But I think generally I would say that I think redwood's probably going to do fine. I think what's a bigger threat to redwood is what happens with the fog belt, right? Whether that changes with climate warming. And there, again, that's very equivocal. I've seen results suggesting more fog and results suggesting less fog in the future. And I think the current trend, maybe cyclical, it might not be, is actually for somewhat less fog. But those mixed systems, I think that Douglas fir is the dominant conifer in that part of the state. And it's, although we cut most of the big pumpkins already, 50 to 100 years ago, it's actively expanding all over down there. And it's filling in systems that probably under the indigenous burning regime were probably largely oak, or hardwood dominated at the very least. So this brings up an interesting question, like the restoration question. What's our target, right? What's our reference site and what's our target and what do we want and what can we keep on the landscape? And those take you in two different places. Native Americans burned an unbelievable amount of the landscape. I don't mean that in a bad or a good way. They just did. It was a really important management tool for them for a variety of reasons. And when you read things like the old Spanish diaries or some of what we know about some of the through oral cultural traditions from a lot of the tribes along the coast, is that it was just consistently being burned. And a lot of the landscape in SoCal, that's today Chaparral, was probably grassland and woodland for a long time. Whereas in Northern California, I think a lot of that lower Doug fir forest was largely oak systems because they were cultivating tan oak, they were cultivating huckleberries, there were basket weaving materials they needed to be able to get to. Successful hunting relied on having more of an open mosaic than is in there right now. So the question is, do we return to that, or do you let it just go back to the climatic climax? It should be a Douglas jungle, basically. And that's a very unsafe fire situation, and also the kind of system that you can tip over really quickly. There's been, if you're interested in the calamus, there have been a couple of really fascinating studies in the last about 3 or 4 years that have looked at the likely long-term implications of current trends in the calamus, and they using climate and just fire effects on tree regeneration and stuff. And they're suggesting not good outcomes. Large loss of conifer forest, massive increase in the amount of shrubland dominated parts of the landscape and stuff like that. Obviously, all of those assume that we don't do anything to stop it.
Next question, I'm jumping around here a little bit. Dan asks, are you able to predict where the greatest loss of old forest is likely to occur over time in the Sierra Nevada? For example, latitudinally, elevationally, current stands.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it could be done. I'm trying to think if anyone's taken a shot at that. The paper that Scott Stevens led a few years ago was just looking at old forest based on extant trends and then projecting that out. But it wasn't like spatially explicit in the sense of saying, this area is more likely to be lost than another area. It could be done. No one's done it yet. And I've talked in my lab at Davis, we've had a couple of meetings where we've talked about, because I have some people in there who are just statistical whizzes, figure out how you would build a model that would take all the interacting stressors and disturbances into account. Because at this point, the only things that are getting used are climate and fire, really. There isn't anything else in there. But one would have to take into account drought periodicity and profundity, beetle and insect, other insects, disease, all that kind of stuff to really get a good idea. But it could be done. It could be done. So my answer is no, I haven't seen that. But I think that what I would expect is that the ones that would be probably the most unstable are the ones that are out on the edges, climatically speaking, right? Like you've seen all the rift. Well, I don't know, maybe some of you guys saw that really fascinating Sacramento Headwaters Basin presentation this morning. That's great work being done by Jim Thorne and some other folks. And they were looking at climatic refuges, basically, right? A lot of it's focused on where can we expect that on the landscape, the climate's going to be at least similar enough that you can keep similar vegetation types and structures. And by 2100, it's what, 14% of the landscape or something like. I think it was for California. It's like, wow. I liked how they were optimistic about, like, wow, believe it or not, it's actually 14%. It's not zero. Like, whoa. But the places that they lose in their models, and I would suspect you'd lose even faster if you throw fire at it, is the ones that are at the edge. So I would say east side of the Sierra Nevada, for example, lower elevation on the west side, where you're kind of getting that warming, that's happening. Nevada City now is like in the heat belt, right? And then if you think about it, if you just think about where climate's going temperature-wise, I mean, if you take the projections for Lake Tahoe and run them out to 2100, it's going to have the climate of Nevada City. That just blows my mind. It is not going to be a snow-driven system at all. And it's going to be well within the parameters for oak. I think that system long-term is going to become an oak forest. So I think, yeah, those kind of places like old growth stands along the eastern edge and at the lower western edge, I would think would be in the biggest trouble. But that's something that could be.
All right, this next question comes from Nina, and I think it refers to a lot of different graphics that you talked about. She says, in the North Coast region, for example, Sonoma County, it seems there was a, quote, step change in the amount of fire, ignitions, acres burned, and impacts. Not sure about burn severity, but starting in about 2017. She asks, did we cross some critical threshold in this area that put us in a new fire frequency regime? Is it driven more by fuels or climate?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think it's driven more by people. All those things almost all of them were human set. A few were lightning. Last year, obviously, we had a huge, crazy lightning outburst, which was pretty random. I mean, that was a northern arm of a tropical storm that got caught in the jet stream and just thrown up over California. That kind of stuff is going to happen sometimes. It just happened to occur in the worst time of the year in the driest summer of nearly the history of California. But I would actually say that 2017, I think it started before that, if you're willing to include Lake County and the counties that matter, because Lake County blew up in 2015. And had another bad year. And there were, a couple fires in 16, and then 17 was another big one. So I think it's really, to be honest, it's been sort of a gradual thing that, like you say, all of a sudden shocked us in 2017 with all of the mortality and all the death. But, there was that great study, real simple one that John Keeley did looking at, was the Atlas fire, I think. That was, what was the name of the old fire that burned in there? Oh my God, forgive me, I should know the names. But there was a fire in the 50s, or maybe it was the 60s, that burned under same kind of thing, one of these east wind events, and almost exactly the same landscape. But in those days, it was just farms. There wasn't anyone living there. And so it burned a similar area, similar number of days. No one even noticed it. It was like, it's fire burned through a bunch of farmland. Then we have the same fire in 2017, and it kills dozens of people, burns thousands of homes. And all of a sudden, it's an international headline. And so I think, the thing that to note is that, number one, that's always been a fire-prone landscape. A lot of it isn't as prone as it was because it's full of vineyards, which are actually really hard to burn. But people have built, what's happened in California and a lot of the West is that we were so good at putting out fires for so long that people completely discounted the fire threat. In fact, most people who moved to Sonoma County, I guarantee you, fire never even came into the equation. They never thought about it. It just wasn't even, they maybe saw smoke on the horizon one time, and you can't do that anywhere in California. Everywhere in California is under big fire threat. Obviously more as you go further south, but as it gets warmer and drier, and as there are more and more and more people, and as more of the Bay Area looks more and more like, Pasadena and Arcadia and the San Fernando Valley and all of that stuff, it's just going to be more and more and more of this kind of stuff. I mean, we 2020 was bad. It will not be the worst year that we ever have. No way. I mean, I'd be super surprised if we saw a year that big right away again. But what are you at right now? 50% precip, maybe currently? A lot of dry wind events already happening. Who knows, right? I mean, it's so much of an ignition thing. But my opinion is that really it's mostly driven by, one, human ignitions, two, the fact that there are so many people in harm's way now that we're just paying more attention to it.
I think this is a good time to ask this question. Jerry said, with 4 million people living in the wildland urban interface, who's doing research on ideal vegetation fire modeling for safety? So I suppose maybe if that's a different type of modeling or just looking at that specific application.
Well, some of that work's been done. Maybe a little more qualitative, but a lot of they've burned different kinds of shrubs, different heights, different, in fact, that's the one place where burning experiments have been really pushed along a lot, right? Is like in the home environment. And CAL FIRE has pretty reasonable, the state has pretty reasonable defensible space restrictions in terms of, they can be understood. I mean, sometimes, I don't know how many of you guys live in areas where you could get inspected, but I think CAL FIRE still has a little ways to go in terms of sort of the customer service side of it all, like making it clear to you what's exactly wrong, because they'll drop off a nastygram and it'll be like, read code, such and such point A, point 2. And then you read it, you go, I think I meant all this. And then you get another nastygram, like, well, wait a minute, someone tell me something, And anyway, whatever. They got a lot of work to do and they're overwhelmed with it. But the concepts of making sure the grass is low around the house, keeping grass green. If you've got shrubs in your landscape that are flammable, ensuring that there's a certain distance between them, that they're only a certain height. Trees have to be trimmed 10 feet away from the property, at least, et cetera, from the building and those kinds of things. And those are all based on principles of flames, fire, heat, energy, intensity, and things like that. They're not just making that stuff up. So I don't know how else to answer that. I mean, of course, there's always more research that can be done in all of those things. But I think the general principles that have been pushed have been shown to be good at protecting homes. Now, I will say this. The one thing that people tend to forget, and you always see it in wildfires, is that people will have, they can have their property around their house relatively fireproofed so that, a flaming front moving through a landscape isn't going to hit their house on the ground because it hits their green grass and, they don't have enough woody vegetation in the yard to carry anything. But most fires that we can't control are being blown by wind. And a lot of properties burn down because of embers, lots and lots and lots of them. And so, I've seen it. It's really common for people not to clean their gutters out. It's kind of unbelievable. But a lot of the homes that burned up, for example, in Paradise, they identified that a lot of the issues were like, non-standard roofing materials and gutters that were completely full of leaves. Also protecting your eaves, right? Making sure that any of the eave vents and things like that they're not open and sparks can't get, embers can't get up underneath the roof, for example. So that's the kind of stuff to worry about. I know I did a lot of work in the Angora fire after that burned in 2007, and actually no one there did any kind of fuel treatment, but the fuel treatments that the Forest Service did outside of the private lands stopped the fire on the ground, but we still lost hundreds of homes, most of them because of ember cast. Because people had wood stacked, they're all firewood people, right? So they had big firewood stacks right up against their house. They had wooden decks all over. They hadn't cleaned any of their gutters out. Some of them had cedar shake roofs, You can't protect your home in that situation.
All right, we have a couple of similar questions, Hugh. So I'm going to read you both of these, and I think maybe you'll be able to tackle them at once.
Okay.
They're both about air quality. So Gary says, air quality requirements have limited some of the prescribed burn opportunities on national forests over the last several decades. Do you see a relaxation in air quality regulations for prescribed burning? So that's the first question. And then the second one from Kristen says, can you speak to the challenge of prescribed fire regarding public perception, public health, and challenges of air quality regulations? What needs to be done to improve this, and what could we do as community members to help?
Okay. Yeah, the air quality thing is a big deal. I mean, we have a lot of impaired air sheds in California. Depends on where you are. You know, North Coast, it's not such a big deal. East side of the state, it's not such a big deal because all the smoke goes off into Nevada. But where it's going to impact Californians, it's an issue. I will say that 10 years ago or so, the air quality barriers to prescribed fire were a huge issue, and a lot of time went into that. And I'll give a lot of credit to people over at Sierra Forest Legacy, like Greg Thomas and some of these other individuals who pushed really hard on state regulators and on the air pollution control districts and CARB, et cetera, to think about how they could better balance their short-term desire to maintain low smoke loads with the longer-term desire to make sure that we don't have those catastrophes, those nuclear days where the entire state is under smoke, or days, I mean weeks or months, right? Think about the last 3 of the last 4 years have been unbelievable, right? I developed asthma from that. Never had any issues with breathing before that, and the pollen load, I guess, in Central Valley. But so I will say that the California regulators have been, after a little bit of hesitance in the beginning, have actually, I think, bent over backwards almost to try to both meet the letter of the law, but also find ways to be flexible so that burning, where it could be demonstrated that it was necessary and important, can actually happen. And I can think of an example. Again, I'll use Angora fire since I live near that fire footprint. Is that occurred in 2007, and we just did an analysis it was actually led by Randy Striplin of the Forest Service, where we looked at the impediments to prescribed fire. Well, it wasn't exactly that. We were looking for, like, how do you predict burn days, but it was kind of looking in a backwards way at impediments to burning in the Lake Tahoe Basin. And we were kind of surprised to find that the air quality day, the green burn days, they call them, the days that we got the green light from CARB to burn, those were not a limiting factor at all. And in fact, after Angora, because of the outrageous amount of smoke that Angora poured into the basin, it lent a little air of realism to the discussion. And after that, CARB actually, I think it was the local air pollution control district, but they relaxed their regulations. And they allowed in other words, they raised their thresholds for when they were concerned, and it freed up a lot more burn days. It turned out that the things that were really driving it more were actual prescription days. In other words, when you're trying to burn, you have a specific envelope of climatic conditions and fuels, moisture conditions, et cetera, right, that you can burn in. And it was difficult to meet those a lot of times, but also, there's risk aversion on the part of the people who have to make the call as to whether you burn. But the other one was what we call preparedness. And that is, did you actually even have the staff around who knew what to do? Like, you have to have the right burn bosses, the right people on site, and they're fighting fires during the fire season. So when you throw all those things together, certain times of the year really got limited in terms of when you could actually burn. But surprisingly, it was not CARB days. I would submit that, except for places that have really bad air, and west side of the Sierra, south of about Merced, maybe, probably, is that, and parts of Southern California are probably the places where you have the biggest trouble in actually pulling off prescribed fire, and for good reason. I mean, people can't breathe down there. That's the center of asthma in the United States, right? Okay, so there was that. And can you remind me, what facet did I not catch of that? There was something about air days.
Let's see, we had, it was mostly about air quality regulations, public perception, public health. What can we do as community members?
Oh yeah, thanks. So the other thing I wanted to note, and I think this is super cool, is that there's actually been a renaissance in public interest in prescribed fire. When the Forest Service and the state came down, brought the hammer down on using fire in the 1920s, there were a lot of white ranchers in California who were using it. They'd learned it from what they learned about indigenous management. They had found it as a really, really useful tool to reduce competition, increase growth, and protect the stands against fire. And Forest Service and the state were like, no, you people know nothing. We're stopping this stuff. And they did. And so prescribed fire, as far as like just a personal, and remember, because of fire exclusion, the Native American tribes in the state were forbidden to use fire anymore. So that's changed a lot. And there are prescribed fire training possibilities out there. For example, these prescribed fire training exchanges, what they call TREX trainings. There are dozens of them across the United States now and even overseas, and they're mostly intended for just the public to go and learn how to use prescribed fire as a management tool. You can actually get qualifications now. CAL FIRE has a process, I think it's still kind of in development, but where the public can actually be qualified as a burn boss, so you don't have to have a person in a green or a blue uniform on site necessarily to pull off a burn anymore. The tribes have had, that's probably the renaissance is a better term for what's going on there. There's a lot of interest in California tribes now in using fire because it was, for them, it was a major management tool, probably the major management tool that they used. And a lot of that, I think a lot of the knowledge was lost, but there still are some fonts of knowledge for that. Very well-known people who've been sharing their knowledge around, and I've gotten more and more involved recently in a couple of events, a couple of initiatives to better understand how cultural burning might be expanded in the state, but also how it might be scaled up so that cultural burning could form part of the solution. And as I said before, in the coast ranges, we don't have a choice. If we're going to reduce fuels in the landscape and try to increase resilience of ecosystems, it isn't going to happen through natural ignitions. That's just not going to happen. And a lot of the landscape, there's just no economic output at all either. So burning is going to be a lot of it. And then what was I thinking about there? Burning, blah, blah, blah. Oh, so one of the really cool things is that I suggest that if you're interested in prescribed fire, like cultural fire use and how you turn it actually into something that's meaningful on landscape scales, check out Northern Australia. They have got the most amazing stuff going on there. Forgive me, I'm forgetting the name of the program, but it's an Indigenous fire use program with Australian Aborigines. And there are a couple of parks in West Arnhem Land and up by Darwin up in the north. It's not on Kakadu. Forgive me, I always forget the name of the park just south of there, but it's one of those gigantic Australian parks. It's the size of an American state, and they've got money from the UN, carbon money, because they were having these huge fires in the system, a lot like we're having, that were having major negative carbon impacts, but they were also wiping out endangered species habitat. They were having impacts on a lot of other ecosystem services. And they came up with, I thought, was the most amazing solution, which was to go back to the tribal entities that continue to live in the landscape and have interest in the landscape and turn fire management over to them. And they just said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to let you guys run fire management in this park, because what you did and what you've been wanting to do, which is to burn it all the time, but in a patchy mosaic, so there's a relatively small footprints of these things. They happen all over the place. We think that, or we're willing to bet that the hypothesis that results in less overall smoke output, more carbon on the landscape, and less negative impacts to endangered species, et cetera, that we're willing to bet that that's a likely outcome. And it was. And it's really amazing. It's pretty easy to find. If you just do some Googling, there is a solid dozen papers out of that system now where they've been monitoring it. And recent summaries of their monitoring results they're astounding. They're meeting all of their management guidelines, and they're reducing carbon loss, and it's being paid for through international funding. I mean, I think it could be a real model for the way that things are done in California. But, there are a lot of roadblocks, obviously, to making that happen. But I think that if there's a state in the union where people are likely to, take some chances, some calculated risks to try to solve some really intractable problems, I think this is the state where it's going to happen. I hope it is.
We're right at 2:30, Hugh. Do you have time to squeeze in one more question?
Sure. Yeah, no problem.
Okay. Well, I'll just save this really difficult and big question for the end and give you 2 minutes to answer it.
Okay.
So Dan asked, he says, the results seem pretty grim. What do you see as possible management actions to preserve Sierra Nevada old growth forests into the future? And I'd also kind of like to tack on to that, get your thoughts on what management strategies you see as the most viable, considering everything you talked about today. Is it managing for resilience in place? Is it actually helping to facilitate some of these eventual transitions that you talked about? Can you answer that kind of broadly as well?
Yeah. Well, so a couple of things. I mean, I'm an ecologist, right? So I think kind of at broader scales, and I'm a geologist by training originally. So I invariably am thinking about long terms and broad landscapes and things like that. And I always have, forgive me, and I know this is probably anathema to an audience like this, because you guys are, probably a lot of you are involved in single species efforts, or at least in old growth type kinds of protection efforts, which are benefiting a certain number of key species. I always get really worried about throwing all of our efforts at quote unquote keystone species or even indicator species in a lot of, because you forget about everything else that's out there. And I think number one, we got to remember that there are thousands of species out there, and that whatever we do to favor one of them is probably not going to favor a lot of the other ones. So it's something to think about. At the same time, I think we've been operating off the precautionary principle for a really long time with these species. I don't think it's been working very well. And if you look at kind of the fact that we've, for the longest time, timber harvest was the biggest threat to fisher, to owl, to goshawk, to whatever. It's not anymore. We're not doing any cutting out there anymore, and yet their populations aren't stabilizing and they're not going up. There are just new threats that are coming, right? Pot farming, pesticides, barred owl, whatever, right? Climate warming, fire. So, and you look at that in Region 6 too, in Oregon and Washington, their biggest loss of spotted owl habitat is all fire now, right? So what's happening here? We haven't done as good a job of demonstrating it. I think what's really key is the recent science that I alluded to. And again, I guess I have to I'm making the assumption that you guys have read all these papers, but maybe some of you haven't. There's some amazing science in the last 2 years on owl, fisher, blackback woodpecker, and it's incredible how they're just parallel in terms of their habitat use. I mean, obviously one kind of enjoys the black side of the habitat more than the green, and the other the green side more, but they're foraging in that edge habitat, right? Along pretty severely burned landscapes, but against places that aren't severely burned. And they're not using those burned areas more than 100, 120 meters into them. That's why I used that Stevens paper, because it was spot on in terms of the part of that. And what's going on is those sorts of patches of high severity burning, on our best estimates, all the best science that's out there suggests that it was pretty rare to see patches like that were more than 5, 10 acres large in the past, maybe 15, 20, maybe now and again you'd get one that was 100 acres. Makes sense, right? You're looking at what these species are adapted to and what they use in the landscape. That comes out of millennia of adaptation, and they don't know what to do with a piece of burned up forest that's the size of San Francisco. There's nothing for them out in the middle of that thing. It's a big time sink, you know what I mean? So we have to understand that they grew up in a landscape, lived in a landscape that had a whole lot of burning, but it was burning that had a lot of different, the outcomes were different. So, and burning is not going to stop. I mean, to me, there are other wild cards now, right? I mean, beetles can kill just as much, just as fast, except they don't remove any fuels in the system. They just add more to it, right, is the problem. But disease can do the same thing. And these kinds of disturbances, they're going to tip the system over really, really fast on us unless we find a way to reduce fuels on a lot of the landscape and to do it real quickly. And so, the idea that we need to be more worried about the short-term effects of some chainsaws, near an owl nest, I don't think we've done the science yet. I think, like I said, I think it's largely precautionary principle. Like, they don't like chainsaws, and they seem to not like it, and they split. Well, you burn that thing up, and they're going to be gone for 50 years instead of one. You know what I mean? So there are those kinds of hard decisions are going to have to be made, and about what has to be done. And I don't know how you hold on to most of those old growth sites if you don't do a little bit of fuels reduction, because they're anomalous. There wasn't much in the landscape that looked like the way these things look these days. They haven't had a fire in 100 years. There wasn't an old growth site in California that didn't burn in 100 years, except maybe in the redwood, fog belt. back in the 16, 17, 1800s. I really doubt that. So I think that's one of the really big things is how do we get ourselves to where we start actually doing some treatment. And I think if I look at like at Region 6, Oregon and Washington, they had all these areas, these experimental, that's embarrassing. But they, when they set up the Northwest Forest Plan, they had all of these experimental areas that they set up in which, even if they had what they call their late Sierra reserves, right, LSRs, which are kind of like our owl packs in Sierra Nevada, they were going to do treatment in specific areas so they could check it out. And you know what? Under threat of litigation, the Forest Service never did any treatment in any of those because no one wanted it to happen. And as a result, we learned nothing, right? We have absolutely nothing to go on. So I would say that, we need to do a lot of bed hedging and we need to start doing some experimental work. We need to start doing treatment in some of those landscapes, the more fire-prone ones in particular. Because I'm just really afraid we're going to lose all of it. And I just know that what I've seen in this science and then the effects of like those studies that came out of the King fire that just showed how the owls are just gone. I mean, it just took out all of those sites. Look, what are we going to find from the Creek fire this year or the Castle fire? There's a huge loss of old forest habitat, or the North Complex or whatever, name your 500,000 acre fire anymore. And if we can't get the landscapes to a point where they can survive at least some of them, that kind of burning, then there isn't going to be any of that kind of habitat to protect anymore, I don't think. My highly optimistic prediction.
On that note, we'll close this out. Thank you so much, Hugh, for your presentation and for sticking around and answering all these questions. So interesting. Do you have any final thoughts you want to leave us with notes before I close us out for the day?
Well, I'll just say thanks for attending. I appreciate it. And I just think that, I don't have answers to a lot of these things. These are really complex, classic wicked problems. And all of us have to hold hands and find out how we move forward. But we do have to move. We can't stand and just look at it like we used to do and just say it's going to be fine, because it's not. It's not going to be fine. And hopefully the last couple of years have woken some of us up to that. And I think that the last thing I'll say is I'm not a Californian originally, but I've lived here a long time, and I'm proud as hell to live in California because this is a state that confronts problems rather than running away from it. The West is full of Californians that ran away from California problems. And luckily, they're changing politics in a lot of the states in the West, in my opinion. They ran away and they stuck their heads in the sand and they didn't want to stay and deal with the problem. And I'm excited to be among the people who want to stay here and solve these problems. We can show a way for a lot of the West. There's money here, there's smart people here, there's industry, there's economics here. And I think this is the place where it's going to get solved, if anywhere. So let's show the way.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's going to take a lot of creativity and a lot of working together to tackle some of these really big and very difficult questions. So better be in it together. All right, well, thank you so much again. And thank you all for attending today. Just a quick reminder, we will post a recording of this talk to our website here in the next couple weeks. So feel free to check it out or share it with others who may be interested. And thank you, and we will see you next time. Have a wonderful day.
Have a great week. Bye.
Bye.